Currently, there is a war on media from our current presidential administration. How do you think Ida B. Wells would have responded to that?
Oh, vehemently. Yeah, I mean, and so Ida was a master at also using the media's words or in this, back in her day, the racist white people's words against them. Because again, back in the 1890s, you still had a lot of the conflict with the U.S. expanding west and how the media depicted the Native American or natives, as they prefer to be called at this point, and calling them barbaric and sadistic, and saying here's what they're doing, and which was fake news.
Right.
So what she did was take what the language that the press was using at that time in describing Native Americans and said, well, if you're saying that that's what Native Americans are doing and they're barbaric, when here's what's happening to the black man, and let's compare this. And if these are the same actions, it's got to be called the same thing. And so, especially for the new administration, is that there's been such hypocrisy for so many things, and so they do. She would do that and say, "Hey, here's what you said on this date," and a few media outlets do a good job of saying, "Here's what you said, and now here's what you're saying." And that's a lot different. So what do you truly mean? What are your beliefs, and what do you stand for? So she would absolutely be vocal about it, and I think she would be masterful about using their words and their actions to say you're being hypocritical. So we've got to hold you to the highest standard that this office respectfully should do.
I think it's really interesting that you're talking about accountability in media, but I also think accountability with policing is really important too. And you know the names Sean Bell, Sandra Bland, Walter Scott, Eric Garner. These are all people who died at the hands of police, innocent of any violent crime. How
Mhm.
closely do you think these types of cases compare to the racial injustice that she wrote about so many years ago?
I've had a lot of discussions on that, and that we talk about lynching and it being at that time a form of terrorism and used to intimidate black people. And so I think we're at a huge challenge in our society to have open dialogue. And so part of the dialogue includes talking about racial profiling, talking about fears, how to overcome fears. And then you've got so much animosity from the black community, and rightfully so much animosity from the black community right now. It's a very difficult situation, and unless we're able to have open dialogue about it, it's going to be difficult. Now, how she would respond to it would be to have some of that open dialogue, talk about some of the challenging issues, and be able to challenge people publicly and openly and say, hey, look, here's what you're doing. So both challenging media about how they portray it, but also challenging police to say, we got to do something different. Is, to have a different standard. And again, the challenge is police are human. And so some people are more afraid of a large black man than a small white woman. So does that mean that a big black man deserves to die because somebody's scared? Absolutely not. So to have that dialogue and say how can we do this, to have more dialogue in the communities about again, Ida is vehement of a fighter she was also respectful. And so how do we have initiate respect between those two, and again, unfortunately, opposing forces right now, where the police are often seen as the enemy versus, if you ask, I remember decades ago asking, I'm blessed to have a number of friends and say, well, how do you feel if the police come around? And my white friends would say, oh, I feel good, I feel safe. And black folks would be like, oh man, something's going to happen.
Right.
And so changing that perception of one another needs to take place. And again, I think that she would be at the forefront of having that open dialogue, challenging the leadership in the country and on the police forces to be purposeful about making changes, not just saying, okay, things need to change and not having a plan to do it. It's like, okay, what are you going to do to make this change happen?
Right. Well, if Ida B. Wells was here today, how do you think she would perceive the struggle of Black Americans today? How would she view the progress? Do you think she'd be marching with Black Lives Matter activists?
Yeah, absolutely. And the So I'll share my perspective on Black Lives Matter is that it was started as a result of the killings, which some people may call lynchings, of Black people. And hearing the news about how some people feel that it's a reverse racist organization and trying to cause problems. Quite the opposite. It's trying to tell the public and naive, especially naive white America, and just a, 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 a tidbit on that is a lot of people who are, when I say aren't racist, they don't have ill will towards Black people. But the challenge is if they don't know that these horrible things are happening, then they can't respond to it and say that something needs to change. And an example is when I worked for a company years ago, I had a friend of mine who's with the company, and he worked in Tennessee, and he's like, "Yeah, there's still some places you couldn't go without problems." And a white woman from the Northeast was like, "What do you mean?" It's like, "Oh, I'm Black. They're not going to like me. I will be in danger." And she was like, "No, that doesn't happen anymore." And so a lot of people come from that perspective. They think that America is great and that there's no racism and that there is no ill will against Black people. So to raise that level of awareness is saying that no, we are still regarded as either lesser people or uh, being feared. And so we need to acknowledge that Black lives matter. That our country is still doing a dastardly deed against Black people, and it needs to be corrected. And so she would absolutely be part of that march.
You mentioned that her family was born into slavery. Her father was a slave, her mother was a slave, and essentially, since she was born in 1862, she was born into slavery as well. And
Mhm.
that's during a time period where it was illegal to teach Black slaves to read, but yet all the members of her family were literate. So education was obviously incredibly important. How important do you think it is now for our progress?
I think it's incredibly important, and there's different types of education. So the ability to read and write is essential.
Right.
So that's the foundation of education. The ability to process that information and transition it to knowledge is important. And so having people be not only be able to read but to think and process is important. And then which ultimately leads to wisdom, which is making wise choices as a result of the knowledge that you have. And so, again, talking to part of what I do is talk to students. So, everything's not for everybody. And so, in our family, education through college was normal. So I was brainwashed as a child, starting from kindergarten. Hey, what are you going to do after college? Like, oh, I don't know. But I knew I was going to college. There was not
Right.
pressure for me to go to college, but also it was not an option. It's like, okay, you go to grade school, go to high school, go to college, and I figure out after I go through college, then I get a choice. But so education from that formal standpoint is important to Ida B. Wells. So just a real quick snippet is that Ida had four children, um, and her youngest, Alfreda, is my grandmother. Alfreda had five children, and of those five children that she had, there are 15 grandchildren. So all five of Alfreda's children not only went to college but got advanced degrees, and all of the 15 grandchildren went to college, and probably half of us, and I'm not including that half, have advanced degrees. So my family's always been a proponent of education. I always will be. That being said, is that there's different types of education. There's again education from the book sense and knowing that, but also education about life and doing what's right and fighting for what's right.
Right. What part of her legacy do you want to carry forward? If there was any part of her legacy that you could pass on to this generation, what would be most important to you?
Let's see a couple of things. One is what I call having integrity. So that's definitely one of the traits. My father and I talked about, what traits did she pass down, or that because my father was never intentional about saying this is something that Ida B. Wells did, so here's what you need to do. But we probably had a conversation when I don't know when I was in my mid 30s or so, asking, hey, so what was passed down? So one, education; two, family, and that a parent needs to stay home and be responsible for the child's education. So no matter what school I went to, I was going to do well because my parents were going to make sure that I did well. And the other thing is integrity and courage, and those go hand in hand. In that, integrity is doing the right thing. So, I learned my lessons about integrity, especially in college. In home, you could leave stuff around, and if it wasn't yours, you didn't touch it. I didn't realize that if I left stuff around the fraternity house, if it wasn't mine, other people would touch it, or borrow it and not not give it back. So that's one form of integrity. But integrity is, knowing what I tell people is knowing what's right and doing what's right, even if you don't feel like it, and even if nobody's looking. And so I translate that to society as, hey, if I know this is right, I need to do it. Hey, if somebody's looking, and again, this is the problem with so many offices, that for people who don't have integrity, once they get to a certain place, they look out for themselves instead of what's best for the most people. It's like, so that's lacking integrity. The other part is of integrity is, and this is where courage comes into it, is what I call standing up, not being a guilty bystander. And again, I've talked about IDB Wells for over 25, almost 30 years now. And in 2000, I used to always think, hey, what would have happened at a lynching? Because lynchings were sometimes spontaneous,
Right.
where something happened and there was mob mentality and it got aggressive and somebody ended up being lynched, beaten, tortured, and killed. Sometimes it was an event where it was scheduled, like, hey, literally come to we're going to lynch this person on Saturday. You get this, and it was an event. For the spontaneous ones, especially, I wonder what would have happened if somebody had said, "Hey, no, stop! This person has had enough." And in 2005, the U.S. Senate issued an apology for never passing any anti-lynching legislation, and I was invited to that as a descendant of Ida B. Wells. And the reason that's important is that 3 times for something to become a law, it needs to go through the House and the Senate, or vice versa, and be approved for it to be a law. So
Mhm.
3 times anti-lynching legislation made it through the House, and all 3 times the Senate did not approve it. And so they issued an apology in 2005 for never having done that. And I met James Cameron, who's namesake to the movie director. He's at the time, America's oldest known lynching victim. In 1930, he was as a teenager, he was with a few other folks, and then he left, and then they ended up committing a crime. The 3 of them were jailed, and then they were taken from their jail. The first 2 separately. One was taken from his jail, beaten, tortured, and killed, so officially lynched. Second person, same thing happened. And then James was taken from his cell, and he was beaten, tortured, and then allegedly one person in the crowd screamed loud enough, "Hey, stop, stop! This man is innocent." And so they released him. They put him back in jail, but that was in 1930. He lived for another almost, I guess, 80 years. I met him in 2005. I think he passed in 2009. But he went on to found the Black Holocaust Museum in Milwaukee, and a number of other wonderful things. But that incident tells me that, again, for lynching to happen, you think about, for a sports team, why does a team have home field advantage? It's because of the crowd, because of that energy that you get. And so for lynchings, I think a lot of them got worse and ended up being a lynching instead of a confrontation, because that energy supported what they were doing. So you start to be, when they get there, okay, mob mentality kicks in, and they ended up killing people instead of just what may have been a fist fight. And so my thing is that if you stand around and watch a lynching and don't do anything to say stop or walk away, say that this is some behavior that should not happen, you are a guilty bystander. And while, again, debatable about how we see lynchings right now, we may not see lynchings, but we still see a number of injustices.
Yes.
And whether those injustices are bullying at school, bullying in the workplace, laughing at a racist or sexist joke, that's supporting that behavior. You're being a guilty bystander. And so the ability to stand up and say, no, this is not right, I can't support that. You don't have to put yourself in harm's way, but to let people know that this action is not acceptable. To me, that's minimally what we need to do in our society. And that's, I think, part of the problem in our communities is there's less accountability in the community as well, as far as what people do. Is in my community, I wanted to do certain things. I wasn't going to be a bad kid, but my neighborhood wouldn't allow it because I had Miss Russell, Miss Brown, Miss Ratliff, Miss Shavers,
Right.
Miss Page, who would, if I'm doing something bad, they'd say stop, and they'd let my parents know. So the ability to stand up for justice, whether it's in your communities, your workplace, your schools, is one of the things that was passed down to me. And I call myself, I don't. So I've done some activist things in supporting others. So those are some things that were passed down. I would say the care for family, education, integrity, and courage are the four prominent things that she passed down.
That's an incredible story, really powerful, and how one voice was able to stop a lynching. I think that's a really powerful lesson there for all of us to take forward. I want to ask you a question about the 151st birthday celebration in her hometown of Holly Springs, Mississippi. What's
Hmm.
going to happen?
Oh, well, let's see. So she was born in. So this will be. So they've because she was born in '62. So this is 57.
Oh,
I don't know. I'm getting my numbers up because I've gone every year. They've had it every year for maybe the past since '98 or so, and I've gone almost every year. And it's a very nice celebration. So again, she's from Holly Springs, so they've got a celebration at the home she grew up in. It's now a museum, so it's open to the public, IDB Wells Museum, and it's powerful. So on Friday they have a lot of youth who perform different skits or plays, and then some adults who have music and really celebrate. And then on Saturday, they organize a tour and they've had different tours between Holly Springs and Memphis. So they have a coach bus that takes a tour of the different areas, and they do different things every year. And then Saturday, there's a banquet where they honor Ida B. Wells. And for the past, this is year number 6, our family gives scholarships to students at Russ College, and that's where Ida went. And so we have criteria that, leaders in the community doing well with education and making a positive difference on campus or at the community at large. And so it's a great ceremony. I mean, it's $1,000, and the tuition at Russ is about $6,000. So $1,000 off of that makes a pretty big difference.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, so it's a nice ceremony for the whole weekend.
Now, I heard that there is a restaurant in Baltimore opening up to honor her career in journalism. Will you come visit?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I've been in dialogue and look forward to lending my support as much as I can. I appreciate the fact that there is I think a renewed interest in general about Ida B. Wells, and
Yes.
for them to honor her is an absolute delight. So I fully support what they are doing to make that happen.
I want to thank
Sure.
my guest, Daniel Duster, for joining us with the stories of his courageous ancestor. I'm your host, Taya Graham. Thank you for celebrating the groundbreaking journalist, Ida B. Wells.